Alan Ladd rode into America's imagination as Shane, a man too strong to stay. Off-screen, he was just a small boy trying to survive the weight of a legend. January 29, 1964. In his Palm Springs home, Alan Ladd was found dead at 50, his body discovered by his wife, Sue Carroll. The official cause, pulmonary edema caused by a lethal combination of sedatives and alcohol. An accident, the coroner declared, though everyone who had known Alan understood the truth was more complicated. The man who had ridden into America's imagination as Shane, the mythic Western hero who walked away into the sunset, had finally found his own way out. Not on horseback into legend, but alone in a bedroom, proving that America's heroes can be destroyed not by bullets but by the roles they could never escape. Hollywood made me a hero, but I never felt like one, Alan had said. And in that confession lay the central tragedy of his life. He had been born small, 5'6", in an industry that worshipped height, in an America that equated masculinity with physical stature. Yet through sheer will, through camera angles and platform shoes and the magic of cinema, he had transformed himself into something larger than life. He became the stoic gunman, the reluctant hero, the man who did what needed to be done and then disappeared into mythology. On screen, he was invincible. In reality, he was drowning. The irony was devastating. Alan Ladd spent his career playing men who walked away from their demons, who rode off into sunsets, leaving their troubles behind. But you can't ride away from yourself. You can't leave behind what you carry inside. And Alan carried so much: abandonment, poverty, inadequacy, a mother's suicide that happened when he was too young to understand but old enough to remember forever. A man is only as big as his shadow, he once said. And his shadow was enormous, cast across movie screens around the world. But the man casting it, he remained impossibly small, a boy who never quite believed he deserved the hero's role he'd been given. What if the real tragedy wasn't that Alan Ladd died too young, but that he spent his entire life trying to become someone he could never be? Not because he lacked talent or looks or charisma, but because the person Hollywood wanted him to be was fundamentally incompatible with the person he actually was? What if every time he put on Shane's costume, every time he mounted that horse and rode toward the horizon, he was riding away from himself? From the scared kid from Hot Springs, Arkansas, from the truth he could never quite escape. To understand how a small boy became a giant on screen and remained small in his own eyes, we must return to the beginning, to a childhood marked by loss and poverty, to a young man who learned early that survival meant pretending to be something you weren't, and to an actor who discovered that the most convincing performances are the ones that cost you everything. Alan Walbridge Ladd was born September 3rd, 1913, in Hot Springs, Arkansas, into circumstances that seemed designed to teach him that the world was fundamentally unsafe, that people you loved would leave you, that security was an illusion and happiness a temporary condition always about to be revoked. His father, Alan Ladd Sr., was an accountant who struggled to provide for his family, who moved them frequently in search of better opportunities that never materialized. His mother, Ina Raleigh, was fragile, emotionally unstable, someone who should perhaps never have been burdened with the responsibility of raising a child. When Alan was 4 years old, his father died, suddenly leaving the family unmoored. Ina moved them to Oklahoma City, then California, chasing stability that remained always out of reach. She worked when she could, but depression made everything difficult. Young Alan learned to be quiet, to be good, to not make demands, as if by being small enough, invisible enough, he might avoid being another burden. But being small and quiet couldn't save her. When Alan was 4, Ina killed herself. The boy found her, or was found with her. The details were never fully clear, suppressed by trauma and family shame. What remained was the wound that never heals, abandonment by suicide, For Alan, it established a pattern that would define his life. The people you love will leave you. The only question is when, not if. And somewhere deep inside, he believed it was his fault, that he hadn't been enough to make her stay. This was where small began. Not just physical stature, but emotional size. The sense of being too little to matter, too inadequate to deserve love, too fundamentally wrong to be worth staying for. The 4-year-old who couldn't save his mother would spend his life trying to become large enough, heroic enough, that maybe he could finally make it not have happened. Alan's childhood after his mother's death was marked by instability and poverty. He was shuffled between relatives in California, never quite belonging anywhere, always aware that he was an obligation rather than a joy. He was small for his age, quiet, the kind of boy who learned to make himself useful because being wanted seemed impossible. He did odd jobs, delivered papers, worked in shops, anything to contribute, to earn his keep, to justify his existence. But there was also something else, a fierce determination not to be defeated, to survive despite everything. Alan discovered he was a good swimmer, and the pool became his sanctuary, the one place where being small didn't matter, where skill and determination counted more than size. He competed, won races, dreamed briefly of Olympic glory. It was a dream that would fade like so many others, but it taught him something valuable, that limitations could be overcome, that the body could be trained to do things that seemed impossible, that you could become more than you appeared to be. High school brought new humiliations and new strategies for survival. Alan was still small, still poor, still marked by loss in ways he couldn't articulate. But he discovered acting, school plays where he could be someone else, where he could step out of his painful reality into characters who weren't haunted by dead mothers and abandoned childhoods. On stage, he could be tall, confident, powerful. On stage, he could be the person he wished he was, rather than the person he feared he'd always be. I was born small, so I had to act larger than life, Alan would later say, and it wasn't just about physical stature. He meant something deeper, that his entire life was a performance, an attempt to convince the world and himself that he was more than the sum of his traumas, that he could be the hero rather than the victim, that he could walk away from his past rather than be defined by it. After high school, Alan drifted through a series of jobs that all seemed to confirm his suspicions about his place in the world. He worked as a grip at Warner Brothers Studios, literally moving equipment for the stars, invisible behind the scenes. He did manual labor, waiting tables, painting houses. He married young, too young, to a woman named Marjorie Jane Harold, and they had a son, Alan Ladd Jr., but the marriage was unstable, marked by Alan's inability to provide, to be the man he thought he should be. Acting seemed like an impossible dream for someone like him. Too short, too poor, too ordinary. But Alan couldn't let it go. He took drama classes, worked in radio where his voice, which was excellent, deep and resonant despite his small frame, could shine without his height being an issue. He did bit parts in films, uncredited walk-ons where he was just another face in the crowd. For years, he was nobody, getting nowhere, accumulating rejections that seemed to confirm everything he'd always feared about himself. Then came 1942 and everything changed. Not because Alan changed, but because Hollywood finally saw what he'd been all along. The perfect noir hero for a dark time. A man whose very smallness, whose quietness, whose sense of being wounded and dangerous made him exactly what audiences wanted. The film was This Gun for Hire, and Alan Ladd played Raven, a professional killer, cold, methodical, hurt. It was a supporting role, but from the moment Alan appeared on screen, something shifted. Here was a new kind of leading man, not tall and imposing like John Wayne or Clark Gable, but compact, coiled, dangerous in his quietness. His voice was soft but menacing. His face was beautiful but dead behind the eyes, as if something essential had been removed. He didn't need to be large because he carried violence in his stillness, threat in his silence. The pairing with Veronica Lake was inspired. She was tiny herself, which made Alan look taller, and their chemistry was electric. Two damaged people recognizing something in each other. The famous hair falling over one eye shot with Alan's face partially hidden in shadow became iconic. These weren't traditional movie star good looks. They were something stranger, more unsettling, more real. This gun for hire made Alan Ladd a star overnight, and Paramount quickly put him under contract. Suddenly, at 30 years old, after a lifetime of being nobody, Alan was somebody. The poor kid from Hot Springs was a leading man. The boy who'd been too small was a movie hero. The man who'd spent his life feeling invisible was being stared at by millions. But becoming a star didn't erase the past. It just gave Alan better tools for hiding from it. Platform shoes to add height, camera angles to make him look taller. Co-stars chosen for their small stature or asked to stand in trenches during scenes. The machinery of Hollywood worked to create the illusion that Alan Ladd was a towering presence, when the reality was a man who still felt 4 years old, still felt small, still felt fundamentally inadequate. The 1940s belonged to Alan Ladd in ways that would have seemed impossible just years before. He became the defining noir hero, playing variations on the same character again and again. The lone gunman, the tough guy with a hidden wound, the man who did the job and then disappeared. The Glass Key, 1942. The Blue Dahlia, 1946. Chicago Deadline, 1949. These were films that established a template for noir masculinity that would influence cinema for decades. But it was off-screen where Alan's true performance was happening. He had to maintain the image of the strong, silent hero when he felt anything but strong or heroic. He had to project confidence when he was consumed by insecurity. He had to be the man audiences wanted him to be, tall, tough, invincible, when he was none of those things. The drinking started as social lubricant, a way to ease the anxiety of being constantly watched, constantly judged, constantly expected to be someone he wasn't. But it quickly became something else, a necessity, the only way to quiet the voices telling him he was a fraud, that someone would discover he wasn't really a star, that he was still just the scared kid who'd found his mother dead. The pills came next. Prescribed for anxiety but used to manage the impossible balancing act of his life. Uppers to function, downers to sleep. A cocktail of chemicals to regulate a system that was fundamentally out of balance. Friends noticed changes. The quiet reserve that had once seemed like strength began to look more like withdrawal. Alan was drinking more, talking less, retreating into himself. There were incidents. Times he couldn't make it to set. Days lost to hangovers or worse. But Paramount protected him because he was valuable, because audiences loved him, because the machinery of Hollywood ran on stars and Alan Ladd was one of their brightest. Behind all that stoic toughness on screen was their unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. The answer was yes, but it was complicated by shame. By the sense that he didn't deserve the success he'd achieved, by the fear that it could all be taken away as suddenly as it had been given. Alan had learned early that nothing good lasted, that security was an illusion, that the people you loved would leave. Now he had fame, money, recognition, but he couldn't trust it, couldn't believe it was real, couldn't let himself relax into it because at any moment it might all disappear. His relationship with Sue Carroll, his second wife and manager, was both salvation and complication. She understood the business, managed his career brilliantly, believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. But she also became another person he feared disappointing, another relationship where he had to perform, another place where the real Alan, the scared, inadequate, broken Alan, couldn't be fully acknowledged. The suicide attempts started in the late 1940s, carefully hidden from the public, dismissed as accidents or exhaustion. But people close to Alan knew the truth. He was trying to escape, to find a way out of the prison his success had become. "People think I'm strong," he told a friend, "but inside I'm still that small boy afraid of being left behind." Except now the person he was most afraid would leave was himself, and the only way to prevent that abandonment was to be the one to leave first. The irony was cruel. Alan Ladd had achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a poor kid in Hot Springs, and it had only made him more aware of how inadequate he felt. Success hadn't healed his wounds. It had just made them more visible, more impossible to ignore. He was living proof that fame and fortune couldn't fix what was broken inside. That external achievement couldn't address internal pain. That you could be a star and still feel like nothing. Shane should have been Alan Ladd's greatest triumph, the role that defined his career and secured his place in cinema history. And in many ways, it was exactly that. A performance of such quiet authority, such understated heroism, such perfect encapsulation of American mythology that it remains iconic 70 years later. But for Alan himself, Shane was something else. A mirror held up to everything he wasn't. A character who represented the man he wished he could be but knew he never would. A performance that was so convincing precisely because it required him to embody everything he lacked. Shane is a Western archetype, the mysterious gunfighter who rides into a valley, protects homesteaders from ruthless cattlemen, and then rides away, refusing the offer to stay and be part of the community he's saved. He's larger than life, morally certain, impossibly skilled, and fundamentally alone by choice rather than circumstance. He's the man who does what needs to be done and then disappears into legend rather than face the mundane reality of ordinary life. Watch Alan in Shane and you see something remarkable happening. This is the role he was born to play, where his physical stature doesn't matter because Shane's power comes from his stillness, his certainty, his absolute command of himself and every situation. The famous buckskin jacket, the carefully chosen angles, the way he towers over young Joey. It all works to make Alan seem larger than he was. But more than the technical tricks, it's Alan's performance that sells it. The way he moves with quiet confidence, speaks with soft authority, conveys both warmth and danger in the same gesture. The final scene has become one of cinema's most iconic moments. Shane, wounded from the final gunfight, mounting his horse while young Joey cries out, "Shane, come back!" And Shane rides away into the mountains, into the sunset, into mythology. The hero who saves everyone but himself, who can't stay because staying would mean being ordinary, being human, being vulnerable in ways he can't allow. For Alan, playing Shane was both transcendent and torturous. He was playing the ultimate version of himself, the hero he presented to the world, while knowing intimately the frightened boy he actually was. Every moment of Shane's quiet strength was a reminder of Alan's own weakness. Every scene where Shane walks away was Alan's fantasy, to be able to leave behind his failures, his fears, his fundamental sense of unworthiness. "I feel more like a ghost than a hero," Alan told a friend during filming, and the statement was prophetic. He was already disappearing, already becoming more myth than man, already losing the battle to remain present in his own life. Shane was a critical and commercial success, cementing Alan's status as one of Hollywood's biggest stars. But success didn't feel like triumph. It felt like pressure, like expectation, like one more weight added to an already unbearable load. Now, he wasn't just Alan Ladd, the actor. He was Shane, the American hero, the mythic gunfighter. Now, the gap between who he was and who he was supposed to be had widened even further, becoming impossible to bridge. The mid-1950s brought increasing struggles. Alan's drinking worsened, the pills accumulated, the suicide attempts became more frequent and more serious. One night in 1955, Sue found him unconscious in their bathroom, an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside him. The ambulance came quietly. No publicity, no scandal. The official story was exhaustion. The reality was that Alan had tried to disappear, to finally ride away into a sunset that wasn't metaphorical. He was saved that time and others. But each rescue felt less like salvation and more like postponement, another temporary stay of execution. His son, Alan Ladd Jr., then a teenager, began to understand that the father he'd idolized, the movie star, the hero, was just a man, broken and scared. There was a night when young Alan found his father passed out in the living room, surrounded by empty bottles and pill containers, and the boy didn't know whether to call for help or pretend he hadn't seen, whether to save his father or protect his father's secret. He chose silence, as children of addicts often do, and carried the weight of that choice into his own adult life. Sue Carroll, caught between being a wife and being a manager, between loving Alan and enabling his destruction, struggled to hold everything together. She scheduled around his bad days, covered for his absences, maintained the fiction that everything was fine while watching the man she loved slowly kill himself. What could she do? In the 1950s Hollywood, admitting mental illness was career death. Seeking addiction treatment meant acknowledging weakness, and weakness was incompatible with being a leading man, a hero, a star. Film offers from the late 1950s show the decline. Alan was still getting roles, still working, but the parts were smaller, the budgets lower, the productions less prestigious. Hollywood was moving on to new faces, younger stars, different kinds of heroes. The noir tough guy that Alan had perfected was falling out of fashion, replaced by method actors like Brando and Dean, who brought a different kind of masculinity to the screen. Alan, at 40-something, was being treated as over-the-hill, yesterday's news, a relic from an earlier era. He tried to adapt, took roles in different genres, but the magic was fading. The camera, which had once loved him, now seemed to highlight his exhaustion, his emptiness, the way the life was draining out of him. Directors who had once fought to work with him now handled him carefully, working around his limitations, adjusting schedules to accommodate his unreliability. He was becoming what he'd always feared, a burden, an obligation, someone people had to manage rather than someone they wanted. The 1960s arrived, and Alan Ladd seemed increasingly like a man out of time. The industry had changed, America had changed, but Alan remained frozen in his own mythology. The reluctant hero who couldn't quite figure out how to stop being heroic. The lone gunman who couldn't lay down his weapon. The man who'd ridden into the sunset but somehow gotten stuck there, unable to move forward or back. His final films, The Carpetbaggers from 1964 being the last completed before his death, show a man who was physically present but spiritually absent. The charisma was gone, replaced by a kind of hollow professionalism. Alan hit his marks, said his lines, but there was nothing behind his eyes anymore, as if he'd finally succeeded in disappearing even while still technically visible. January 29, 1964. The details of that final day remain somewhat unclear. Alan was at his Palm Springs home with Sue. He'd been drinking. Alan was always drinking by then. He'd taken medication, sedatives to help him sleep, pills to manage anxiety. Whether it was miscalculation or something more deliberate may never be fully known. Sue found him in bed, unresponsive, rushed to the hospital but already gone. The combination of alcohol and sedatives had caused cerebral and pulmonary edema. 50 years old, but his body was that of a much older man, worn down by years of chemical assault. The funeral was small, private, attended by family and a few close friends. No crowds, no spectacle, just quiet grief for a man who'd been larger than life on screen and impossibly small in his own estimation. Elizabeth Taylor sent flowers. Other Hollywood names paid respects. But the industry had already moved on, as it always does, to newer faces and different kinds of heroes. The obituaries mentioned Shane, of course. You couldn't write about Alan Ladd without mentioning Shane, but they struggled to capture who he'd been beyond that role. The reluctant hero, the lonely gunman, the small man who'd played giants, the boy who never recovered from his mother's death, the actor who'd given audiences what they wanted while slowly dying inside, invincible on screen, invisible in life, America's hero, Hollywood's casualty. Was his death as straightforward as reported, or were there hidden forces at play? The hidden forces were visible to anyone paying attention. An industry that commodified masculinity and then punished any deviation from the ideal. A culture that equated worth with physical stature and made Alan feel inadequate every day of his life. A system that valued image over substance and gave Alan no space to be anything but the hero. And perhaps most significantly, the trauma of childhood abandonment that was never addressed, never healed, never even fully acknowledged. In the years since Alan's death, Shane has only grown in stature, recognized as one of the great American films, a perfect distillation of Western mythology. The image of Shane riding away into the mountains has become iconic, reproduced endlessly, referenced constantly, ingrained in the cultural memory. Alan Ladd achieved the immortality he never believed he deserved, but it came at the cost of everything else. Film scholars now recognize Alan as a pivotal figure in film noir, someone who helped define a particular kind of American masculinity. Wounded, dangerous, fundamentally alone. His influence can be seen in countless actors who came after, in the anti-heroes and reluctant protagonists who populate modern cinema. He showed that heroes didn't have to be tall or loud or traditionally powerful. They could be small, quiet, coiled with suppressed violence and unspoken pain. But beyond the artistic legacy, Alan Ladd's life raises uncomfortable questions about fame, about masculinity, about what we ask of our heroes and what they give up to become them. He showed that you could be a star and still feel like nothing, that success couldn't heal childhood wounds, that playing heroes couldn't make you feel heroic. He proved that the most convincing performances sometimes come from people pretending to be everything they're not, and that such performances can be fatal. A man is only as big as his shadow, Alan said, and his shadow stretched across movie screens, enormous and mythic. But the man casting it remained small, vulnerable, ultimately unable to carry the weight of his own legend. He became America's hero by pretending to be larger than life, and that pretense killed him. Slowly, inexorably, as surely as any bullet from any gunfight. The tragedy of Alan Ladd is that he gave audiences exactly what they wanted: the stoic gunfighter, the reluctant savior, the man who rode into the sunset. But in becoming that figure, he lost himself completely, disappeared so thoroughly into the role that there was nothing left of Alan Walbridge Ladd, the scared boy from Hot Springs who'd spent his life trying to be something more than he was. Alan Ladd didn't die riding into the sunset. He died in a bedroom, alone, proving that America's heroes can be destroyed not by bullets, but by the roles they could never escape. A man is only as big as his shadow, Alan had said. His shadow stretched across movie screens, enormous and mythic, Shane riding away, forever young, forever heroic, forever untouchable. But the man casting that shadow remained small, vulnerable, ultimately unable to carry the weight of his own legend. He became America's hero by pretending to be larger than life, and that pretense destroyed him, slowly, inexorably, as surely as any gunfight. The questions his life poses remain urgent. When we celebrate stoic heroes on screen, do we demand that actors live as their characters do? Emotionally repressed, perpetually strong, incapable of vulnerability? How many Alan Ladds are dying slowly behind immortal roles, unable to ask for help because heroes aren't supposed to need it? Can we learn to love the real person, flawed and struggling, rather than worshiping only the shadow they cast on screen? In the decades since his death, Shane has only grown in stature, recognized as one of the great American films. The image of Shane riding away has become iconic, ingrained in cultural memory. Alan Ladd achieved immortality, but it came at the cost of his life, his peace, his ability to be anything other than what audiences needed him to be. He showed that you could be a giant on screen while feeling impossibly small in life. He proved that the most iconic performances sometimes come from people who are dying inside, who have no choice but to be convincing because the alternative is confronting unbearable reality. He demonstrated that fame couldn't heal childhood wounds, that success couldn't address trauma, that external achievement couldn't fix internal pain. His legacy lives in every reluctant hero who followed, every quiet gunman, every protagonist who walks away rather than stays. But it also lives in the warning his life provides, that we have a responsibility to see the person behind the performance, to value humanity over mythology, to recognize that the shadows we worship on screen are cast by real people who deserve more than to be consumed by their own legends. Alan Ladd rode into our imagination as Shane, a man too strong to stay. The truth was simpler and sadder. He was just a small boy who never learned he was big enough, who never believed he deserved the love he received, who spent his life trying to become the hero he played while remaining convinced he was nothing. The boy who couldn't save his mother became the man who saved everyone on screen but couldn't save himself. The child who felt too small became the actor who seemed too large. The person who wanted only to be enough became the legend who was never allowed to be human. In the end, Alan Ladd's greatest performance wasn't Shane or any other role. It was the decades-long performance of being Alan Ladd, the movie star, the hero, the icon. And like all performances, eventually the curtain had to fall. The difference is that when the curtain fell on Alan Ladd, there was nothing left behind it. Just a small boy who'd been playing dress-up in hero's clothing, who'd finally exhausted himself trying to convince everyone, especially himself, that the costume was real. "Shane! Come back!" the boy cried in the movie, but Shane rode away because heroes always ride away, because staying means being ordinary, being human, being vulnerable. Alan Ladd rode away too, but there was no mythic sunset waiting, just Palm Springs, just pills and alcohol. Just the final escape from a life that had become unbearable despite all the fame, despite being the hero, despite everything he'd achieved by pretending to be larger than he was. The shadow remains, enormous and immortal, cast across generations. But the man who cast it is gone, and the lesson he left behind is this: we can celebrate the art without demanding the artists sacrifice themselves to create it. We can love the performance without requiring the performer to die for it. We can have our heroes without destroying the human beings who play them. Alan Ladd was small, in stature, in his own estimation, in his ability to withstand the weight of being America's hero. But his shadow was large enough to stretch across decades, to influence countless actors, to define what American heroism looks like. The tragedy is that he never believed it, never felt big enough, never understood that the shadow he cast was proof of something substantial, something real, something that mattered. He died trying to escape that shadow, to finally ride away like Shane, to disappear into some sunset where he wouldn't have to be the hero anymore. But shadows don't disappear. They just grow longer as the light fades. Alan Ladd's shadow stretches still, reminding us of what we ask of our heroes and what they pay to give it to us.